old friends, new friends. We have quite a group here. We welcome you here. This is the grand finale of our Theologian in Residence series that we've had this year. We had 4 speakers last semester and 4 this semester. And for those of you who don't know about our program, the Theologian in Residence was housed at John the 23rd for 30 years? More than that.
74 to 2012.
And I'm a business professor, so in business professor talk, we spun off.
Yes.
So, as spin-offs, this was our first year as a spin-off, and we were learning what to do and how to do it. We learned a lot. We felt really good about what happened this year. I want to introduce Gretchen, but I'd like to introduce the board members first. And if you could stand and keep standing while we recognize you.
Okay.
Jim Reed. Jim Reed was the former religious education director at John the 23rd.
Right.
And now is a counselor.
Right.
I'm hoping I get these introductions right
Yes.
after all the people that I've been working with all this time.
Yeah.
Bill Nealon, where are you? Bill Nealon is attorney in town, and he lets us meet at his office, and has been great support. Ruth is are you still CEO and president? Or?
No. I retired the 1st of January.
She retired the 1st of January and has been great with us for a long time on the board and a great supporter. Joachim Vines was the theologian in residence for 40 years.
34 years.
We lose. And he's created quite a community that we've all grown to love.
David Reed.
And David Reed. David's our newest member of the board, and he's the reason we're meeting here, and he's the reason why all the technology works, and we have cookies and fruit. And Randy. I wasn't going to forget.
Okay.
Helen Day also.
What's that?
Helen Day.
Yeah. That reminded me.
You have a lot of coaching.
I don't want to leave anybody out. Randy is a professor of veterinary science, and when his other job is to run the videos for us. And Helen over here, who's treasurer, a long time supporter of the program.
Yeah.
And I have to say,
One more. Maria Eisen.
Maria! And Maria helps us with making flyers and making sure emails go out, and it's been a great group. I want to tell you that this has been an amazing year for all of us. I think that we all feel blessed to have been part of this. Every single event that we've had went better than we thought it was going to go, and it's just been a magical experience for us. And we thank all the supporters in the community, and we're reaching out to broader community. And please help me thank these wonderful people that have been So, Gretchen Baumgardt we were in contact with each other and realized our common interest with the Theologian in Residence program and her research and what she's been working on. And so we were like, you have to come out. We have to talk in person. And so arranged for her to come out for the final talk tonight. She has a Master's of Divinity from Notre Dame and just finished her dissertation from Marquette. She has also been in campus ministry. She has her area of research is ecofeminism and ecofeminism theology. And it's been delightful to get to know her. We've gotten to know her last night and today. We're making her talk the whole time. And I have to say, we took her to dinner last night, and I had my 2 sons, 17-year-old and 22-year-old, and we asked her, can you explain ecofeminist theology to this age group? And she did a great job. And then we met this afternoon, or this at lunch, and had a very high-level discussion among people who study theology about ecofeminism theology. And so obviously can talk at all different levels. So help me welcome this place.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Can everyone hear me okay? I have a tendency to speak quickly, and when I get excited about things, hopefully I won't knock the microphone over here. I also tend to speak a little softly. If you get to a point where you can't hear me, or so, just raise your hand and say slow down, and I will not be offended in the least. So, well, I would like to begin by thanking all of the board members of the Theologian Residence Program for your invitation to be here this evening. And especially like to thank Yolanda. She's been a constant companion in conversation since last fall, and she's been tremendously hospitable toward me, and as the other members of the board I've been able to get to know. And I'm really honored to be part of this year's program. As I was saying at dinner, as an emerging scholar among esteemed speakers and theologians. And I'm very excited to explore dimensions of ecofeminist theology in the first and third worlds with you tonight. During our time together, I hope to provide an introductory window into a dynamic and crucial hermeneutical approach to theology that seeks to respond to key challenges facing our global community today. Due to the broad nature of ecofeminism, I'm going to be limiting the scope of my comments to Christian ecofeminist theologies, highlighting the voices that are often at the margins of theological discourse. I'd like to begin by giving you a roadmap, if you will, for my lecture. First, I'll start by shedding light on the profound, concrete impact of environmental degradation on women in the third world. Next, I'll explore key dimensions of an ecofeminist hermeneutic as it relates to Christian theology. Then, I'll briefly trace the development of Christian ecofeminist theology. And finally, I'll compare and contrast first and third world approaches. In particular, I'll focus on the ecofeminist theology of Indian theologian Aruna Nagadasan. She is of the Church of India and former coordinator for justice, peace, and creation, and executive director for planning and integration in the General Secretariat of the World Council of Churches. Her work is shaped by her social and cultural context, incorporates sources from various secular and interreligious interlocutors, and exemplifies the ways in which third world women theologians build upon and differentiate themselves from first world theologians. Given various appropriations and critiques, one may question the use of the modifiers first world and third world. Influential Filipina theologian and married sister, Virginia Fabella acknowledges how third world typically referred to underdeveloped and developing countries, with this distinction facing more scrutiny after 1989. However, she points out that organizations like the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, founded in 1976, recognize this designation as valid and significant for their self-identification. In fact, some theologians of underrepresented groups in the U.S. also categorize themselves as third world theologians. Anglican theologian and 2011 president of the American Academy of Religion, Kwok Pilon, who is originally from Hong Kong, adds that the term third world can also be used metaphorically to convey a third space, a space that's not bound by a binary mindset or dualistic and hierarchical constructions. In consonance with this concept, an ecofeminist hermeneutic also seeks to move beyond the confines of dualistic and hierarchical dimensions of theology. Kwok also points out how some indigenous peoples see their concerns as different from the third world, leading some to refer to themselves as the fourth world. In light of how these self-designations maintain important meaning in theological circles, I continue to employ them. Right now, I'd like us to pause for a moment and think about any prior knowledge, assumptions, or images that come to mind when I say the word ecofeminism? Jot down a few notes if you like. Where did you first hear this word? Tonight, maybe? How do you think ecofeminism relates to Christianity, specifically the Catholic tradition? Have you had the opportunity to read any works of third world theologians? If so, what strikes you about their work? And if not, why do you think that is? We can return to these questions later on, but for now we'll explore the impact of environmental degradation on third world women. In recent years, various research studies endorsed by the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change document the negative effects of climate change. In particular, these studies reveal the exponential growth in climate change forced by human activity, which contributes significantly to environmental degradation. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which accepts and cites these findings in its documents, affirms that climate change most adversely affects people living in poverty, even though they contribute least to this problem and have the fewest resources to resist its harmful implications. Women in the third world represent the majority of persons in this category. Lorena Aguilar, Senior Advisor for Gender of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, explains that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities and slows progress toward gender equality. Girls and women in the third world typically bear the primary responsibility of procuring resources for their families. Specific climate changes, such as drought, desertification, and erratic rainfall, increase the time necessary for them to attain these resources, limiting opportunities for income and education. Likewise, the loss of domestic plant and animal species contributes to food insecurity, which diminishes their ability to provide for their families. Given that many women in the third world depend heavily upon forest resources to meet the daily needs of their families, more women face harm due to deforestation. Gender injustices related to climate change also pose grave physical danger to girls and women. Traveling longer distances for resources puts them at higher risk of sexual violence and of physical injuries resulting from heavy lifting. Limits placed on mobility and access to resources for some women also leads to disproportionate effects of natural disasters compared with men, including increased risk of infectious diseases and death. These implications highlight an undeniable link between gender inequalities and environmental degradation. However, experiences of injustice often lead women to become advocates for ecological preservation, which is true for women in the first world and in the third world. Indigenous women also possess incredible biodiversity knowledge that preserves ecosystems. While acknowledging the disproportionate harm experienced by women in the third world as a result of climate change in particular, the recognition of their agency and knowledge is stressed by third world women theologians. The devastating effects of environmental degradation and the intersection of gender and ecological injustices inform an ecofeminist hermeneutic, to which we now turn. German sociologist Dr. Maria Meiss and Indian environmental activist Dr. Vandana Shiva have referred to ecofeminism as a new name for ancient wisdom. The term itself, ecofeminisme, originated with French writer Françoise Sauvant in her 1974 book, Feminism or Death. However, Canadian Catholic theologian Heather Eaton observes that long before ecofeminism was a popular term, women were active on ecological issues. She cites how shifting social consciousness and the rise of social movements related to race, equality, and peace in the 1960s in North America and Europe developed a closer relationship with environmental movements. Along with activist movements protesting the effects of militarism and toxic pesticides, ecological feminist connections began to formulate among various groups and associations, such as politicians, academics, and health professionals, growing significantly and globally by the 1990s. Eaton describes ecofeminism as an intersection point, a lively phenomenon, and a multidisciplinary and increasingly international insight. Simply put, ecofeminism unites two concerns, ecology and justice for women, as noted by British Catholic theologian Mary Gray, who has worked extensively on environmental projects with Indigenous women in India. Today, ecofeminists from around the globe write from various religious and spiritual perspectives, secular approaches, and academic disciplines. Even when limited in scope to a hermeneutic for Christian theology, neither feminist nor ecofeminist theology is monolithic. Although ecofeminism encompasses a diversity of approaches as it continues to evolve, principal presuppositions support an ecofeminist hermeneutic. As American Catholic theologian Ann Clifford affirms, ecofeminism recognizes the link between the domination of women and other forms of social domination, such as classism or racism, and the exploitation of non-human nature. Thus, ecofeminism supports and promotes the intrinsic value of all creation, this is key, and is committed to redressing the disproportionate effects of domination on both women and ecosystems. Clifford further avers that the major goal of ecofeminists is nothing short of a radical transformation of consciousness. Ecofeminism also has a strong emphasis on praxis, which necessitates active engagement with and resistance of forces of destruction and the promotion of alternatives. Along these lines, Eaton and American sociologist Lois Lorenzen explained that ecofeminism is, quote, a textured field of theoretical and experiential insights, encompassing different forms of knowledge embodied in the concrete. So you can see there's both a theoretical and an activist dimension, both theory and praxis, if you will, that combines ecofeminism, which is somewhat unique, at least in the field of theology. Eaton and Lorenzen also present three claims they observe to be central to connecting women and nature in ecofeminism: the empirical, the conceptual, and the epistemological. The empirical claim is that environmental problems disproportionately affect women in most parts of the world, as we discussed earlier. The second claim is that women and nature are connected conceptually and symbolically in Euro-Western worldviews, which supports this dualistic and hierarchical approach, as we discussed earlier. Women are connected with nature, body, femininity, and men are connected with the supernatural, the mind, and masculinity, which is considered as superior and suggests that male power and domination over women is seen as natural and warranted. The third claim is that women have what's called an epistemological privilege about ecosystems that can help redress environmental degradation, given their work proximity to nature and expertise in ecological systems and agriculture, particularly in the third world. Eaton and Lorenzen point out that most ecofeminists avoid essentialist arguments in making these claims and consider the connection between women and nature to be rooted in their experience and their practices. Along these lines, Nada Dasen, like many third world feminist theologians, places more overall importance on the need to ensure that the marginalized voices can be heard, such as the voices of Indigenous Indian women who have unique ideas to help transform injustice. While acknowledging that tensions can arise between feminists and ecofeminists, she points out that the diversity of many ecofeminisms in our world are quote, all pioneered by women passionately committed to justice and dignity for women and for all of creation, emphasizing the beneficial aspects of plurality of visions. This isn't to say that men can't be partners in this as well, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So these voices help to frame an operative understanding of an ecofeminist hermeneutic, to which I'd like to add three caveats. First, while ecofeminism addresses the negative effects of male gender bias, men are very important partners in endeavors supporting ecofeminist concerns, which can be exemplified by the work of the Danya movement in India and the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. Ecofeminism seeks to end discrimination against women and men and treatment of non-human nature, as if it's just a thing, or that peoples are things that exist, particularly for nature, that it exists solely for human benefit, thus really emphasizing the intrinsic value of all creation. And also, too, our interdependency with it. My second caveat, as Clifford points out, an important characteristic of ecofeminism as a theory is that ecofeminists prefer the word ecology over environment, because they see ecology as way more inclusive than environment. They see that ecology also affects a more holistic approach, and like I said, includes both non-human nature in a way that affirms its integrity in and of itself. Third, some Christian feminist theologians, especially women from the third world, discuss ecological concerns under the umbrella of globalization, post-colonial theology, or in relation to violence against women without the moniker ecofeminist. So that means that people may be doing this type of theology, but they may not be self-identifying as ecofeminists. And this is due in part, as Yvonne Guevara points out, she's a Brazilian Catholic ecofeminist, that many communities in the third world have never heard of the word ecofeminism. I mean, consider how many of us probably heard of it, including myself, until I started reading more about it. But many of these people are still living and attempting to redress the interrelated injustices facing women and vulnerable ecosystems. Also, because of the work that many women in the third world are doing on the ground, as we talked about earlier today, is they don't have time to be writing articles on ecofeminism because they're living and breathing it. The other thing is that many works written by third world theologians are published by local presses in the third world, making these resources more difficult to discover, let alone attain. I found that to be a very difficult piece when I was trying to research for my dissertation. Where are these sources? And that's one of the reasons, as I'll talk about later, that I pursued, aside from the fact that I just really connected with Ananda Dasen, is that the resources for Catholic feminist theologians are very few, at least that I found when I was researching for the third world. So overall, an ecofeminist hermeneutic recognizes the interrelated aspects of oppression, particularly the link between the domination of women and the domination of ecosystems, and promotes ecological and social justice and healing for all of creation. Ecofeminism also continues to develop as a field within various disciplines, and women from the third world have broadened its scope of concerns to be more attentive to the dire situation of women in their communities. Theology is no exception. So in what ways does an ecofeminist hermeneutic inform and shape Christian theology? From a historical perspective, Christian feminist theology is typically categorized in three waves of development, beginning in the mid to 19th century. I just want to briefly trace where ecofeminist theology fits in the general feminist theology piece, because I'm not sure what familiarity people have with it. It won't take me very long, trust me, I don't want you to fall asleep on that. The 1960s is considered the beginning of what's called the second wave of feminist theology, in which first world women began to pursue advanced degrees in theology previously reserved to men, and to present new hermeneutics for understanding scripture and tradition, so seeing that through the lens of women's experience. And then also too, despite championing the concerns of women, these initial feminist theologies didn't adequately address racism or classism, unfortunately, and then were later normed by what some of you may have heard as womanist theologians, African American perspectives, or mujerista perspectives from Latinas, just to say that, wait a second, we cannot universalize all of women's experience. And theologies that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s comprised movements that could shake this absence of racial and cultural differences in previous waves of feminism. This third wave also includes the development of Christian ecofeminist theologies and theologies written by third world women. First world feminist theology has also increasingly discussed the relationship between ecology and feminism, especially since the 1990s. One name some of you might be familiar with is Rosemary Radford Ruether and possibly Sally McFay. They're two of the most prolific first world Christian theologians to write on ecology and feminism, beginning in the mid to 1970s. And both first world and third world theologians consistently acknowledge the contributions of Ruether and McFay, even if they disagree with certain aspects of their trajectory of thought. Ruether also adds a fourth stage to the development of feminist theology that includes a 1994 meeting of first world feminist theologians and third world women theologians in Costa Rica with the theme, Women Resisting Violence, Spirituality for Life, which led to the 1996 publication of an anthology of essays from this meeting. This is key because one of the issues I believe that's seriously problematic in first world academic theology today is the lack of connection between first and third world theologians, where there's dialogue happening between them. And so the fact that this is somewhat groundbreaking that this anthology was published in 1996. Ruether also observes a fifth stage in secular feminism, which she identifies as transnational feminism or global feminism from below. She argues that new networks of dialogue and solidarity between first and third world women being formed as a result provide a context for future work in feminist theology, whereby they can be mutually informed. One other point that Ruther makes is that ecofeminism among middle-class Western women may be turned into a kind of consumer spirituality and a singular focus on self-cultivation, so that it becomes this kind of romantic vision or this desire that's disconnected from any kind of social critique, and that it may become irrelevant to the struggle against the poor and the devastation of the planet. But despite this, Ruther still believes that there's benefits in ecofeminist theology, and it's the way it addresses issues of violence both against the earth and women on theoretical and practical levels. And I could spend the rest of the time talking about Ruther's work. I don't know, she's got to be like in her mid-80s, and she still writes and writes and writes and writes. She's just nonstop. She's just one of those women who has continued to evolve as a person and evolve as a theologian over time. And McFay, in her off-cited work, The Body of God, which some of you may be familiar with, came up with this concept of looking at the world or the universe as God's body. And she understands that this model is not without its limitations, but she explains that it focuses on embodiment. And she says, quote, inviting us to do something that Christians have seldom done, think about God and bodies. However, she argues against reducing God to the world or humans to their bodies, but promotes the concept of what's called panentheism, not pantheism, instead, in which God maintains both transcendence and immanence at the same time. In this view of panentheism, all creation originates in and cannot exist without God. And as Christians, the incarnation of Jesus Christ affirms the importance of embodiment and the Holy Spirit as the source of renewal of life. This renewal of life and direction or purpose leads creation toward the goal of inclusive love. One other point about McFay is that she says that when she began her theological study, the idea of an ecological anthropology would have been foreign to Western theologians in light of the anthropocentric focus of both anthropology and Christianity. So what that means is, for those of you who may not know, theological anthropology looks at how we understand what it means to be human from a theological perspective, right? And seeing it, typically it's been seen through, beginning because only men were typically studying theology through the lens of male experience, and then trying to broaden that to not only to women's experience and to all human experience, now considering to broaden that to all of nature, not just human nature. That's where she's coming up with that idea of the ecological anthropology. She argues for a shift from an internalized anthropology of radical individualism in order to promote the survival and flourishing of the planet. She avers, quote, ecological theology is not a New Age fad. Rather, it returns this tradition to its cosmological roots, end quote. Likewise, like I said, an ecological anthropology must be attuned to humanity's interdependency with the rest of creation. So it's not, again, not solely what the universe or the planet can do for us, but how can we live in relationship with one another. As Gray points out, there's still a huge chasm of ignorance as to what is meant by ecofeminism and what it offers to Christian theology. She writes that one of the key characteristics of ecofeminist theology is that it's a fusion of the environmental movement, feminism, and women's spirituality, with the underlying guiding principle that all life, including all of creation, is sacred. Clifford likewise affirms that ecofeminism offers Christian theology a foundational perspective for responding to questions about the meaning of human creaturehood. More specifically, as part of the shift in consciousness, she explains, quote, that ecofeminist Christian theologies not only encourage us to new thinking about our relationships to all other forms of life, but also challenge us to embrace these new relationships as agents for healing change, end quote. I think that's really another, aside from, in addition to, I should say, the focus on the shift in consciousness, is this focus on healing and reconciliation all through the ecofeminist literature. Clifford also argues for an empathic or empathetic ecological solidarity, similar to McFay, that requires both becoming informed of global ecological crises and making life choices that take care of the earth into consideration. So that was our little short history lesson. So we can see how ecofeminism encompasses, even within the first world, a diversity of voices. I know we haven't gotten to many of them, but that also both social and cultural contexts allow for unique nuances of an ecofeminist hermeneutic for Christian theologies. In comparing and contrasting how first and third world theologians employ an ecofeminist hermeneutic, we see a universal concern for the interrelated aspects of oppression that impact women and non-human nature most adversely. Now, Dawson reminds us that the relationship between women and non-human nature plays out differently between continents, nations, and even within localities. Praxis, often in the form of social change, is key, especially for third world theologians. And as I was mentioning to a couple of people at lunch earlier, this is a huge problem I find in theology as well, where anything practical is looked upon with suspicion. It is not, in the academy, there's such an emphasis on the theoretical, which is very important, but there's also been a divorce in a way from the practical lived experience of people. So ecofeminism tries to bring those two together, not minimizing one or the other. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, most third world theologians have either been educated in North America and informed by first world theologians, or both, but they share a commitment to keeping the concerns of the most vulnerable at the forefront of their theologies. And as noted earlier, several prominent first world Catholic feminist theologians engage works written by ecofeminist theologians from the third world in their writings, including Clifford, Ruther, Eaton, and to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Johnson. Theologians Mary Judith Ress, who's originally from the US, and Gabriel Dietrich, originally from Germany, moved to Chile and India respectively, became involved in local women's movements, and write from this context. So they really felt a life calling to go and work with and live with the poor, and so as a result, they're able to write from those perspectives and share, and again, bring women's experiences to the forefront of conversation. However, like I mentioned, apart from Guevara, few written resources are available from Catholic third world ecofeminist theologians. Therefore, I draw primarily from Protestant third world ecofeminist theologians from Asia. This disparity raises questions about accessibility, opportunity, and marginalization of Catholic third world women. That being said, there's still much to glean from current third world ecofeminist theologies. Recognizing the influences on their own work, Nada Dawson and Guevara, who clearly define themselves as ecofeminist theologians, express gratitude in their writings to first world, Christian liberation, and feminist theologians. Fabella concurs that while third world women benefited greatly from both theologies written by feminist and liberation theologians in the West, and liberation theologies from the third world, including third world men, further exploration of their own context, culture, and experience led third world women to redefine theology in new ways. She points out that their critical understanding of their experience of multiple oppression of women in church and society, and their active involvement in the struggle toward greater equality, comprise two aspects that shape the development of third world theologies written by women. Fabella and other women theologians from the third world also overcame many difficulties in establishing a women's commission of the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, particularly resistance from third world male theologians. Nada Dawson bemoans the fact that several theologies of third world women have been omitted from both mainstream and liberation theologies written by third world men. She reveals that third world women are told, quote, that poverty, national liberation, racism, etc. must come first, and that we betray third world cultures when we speak on issues related to women, end quote. Similarly, in contrast with third world men, she explains that third world women give equal weight to the struggles of the earth for its integrity. So again, seeing that interconnectedness between human nature and non-human nature. Related to these challenges, Nada Dawson recognizes that first world women continue to experience oppression by first world men. But in light of the disparities between the lives of women in the first and third worlds, she encourages first world women to acknowledge their place of privilege in our global community. Excuse me. She points out, quote, any feminist vision of creation has to embrace and acknowledge cultural and social norms of discrimination that make the lives of some women more precarious than other women. End quote. Not discounting the importance of universal human rights, her claim resonates with feminist theologians who question the tendency to universalize women's experiences through the lens of majority groups. And this even includes, like Kwok Pulan has pointed out, this includes like women who tend to universalize Asian women's experience, because even within that, there are different levels of class and such. Nadadasan also explains how essentialism often minimizes the cultural and political dimensions of the historical subordination of women to men and of women to other women, citing racism and classism in the first world and the caste system in India as examples. Nadadasan maintains that a key difference between the first and third world ecofeminist perspective is the way in which they address poverty in their writings. In contrast with first world women, Nadadasan explains that women in the third world see the poverty that afflicts whole communities, particularly women and children, as the baseline for understanding the domination of women in nature. She notes that in India and other parts of the world, the divisions of labor that we talked about earlier ensure that women are doing the type of work that makes them work in close proximity to the resource of the earth. Highlighting another difference in the methodologies of first world and third world women, Favela notes that to lend credibility to their statements, they favor quoting, for example, a poor woman from a depressed urban area, in contrast with the first world practice, including Western feminism, of citing scholars or experts. So for third world women theologians, they see the actual lived experiences of women in poverty as the scholars and experts to inform their theologies. Likewise, third world women theologians consider their theologies primarily accountable to the marginalized. Ghanaian Protestant theologian Mirza Amba Odioye, who I believe is a Methodist, I think, describes how many African women employ a narrative theology, utilizing their life experiences and sharing their reflections in the form of stories, in order to, quote, continue the study of theology beyond the academic realm. By doing so, Odioye says that they struggle to make religion dynamic and relevant and a liberative force that will enhance human life and sustain ecosystems. Guevara actually lives and works among the poor in Brazil, and she develops an ecofeminist epistemology out of the lived experience of the marginalized. This seems to be a theme that we keep coming back to, as you can see. She says that she tells a great story of how she was trying to explain what ecofeminism was, and she was having a really hard time. It was like, well, it's this, it's that, for a group of women that were gathered at a lecture she was giving. And this woman said, oh, okay, when I first heard that, I thought you said ecofeminism was an echo of feminism. Yeah. And Guevara writes that she thought that was incredibly witty of this woman, and she continued to use that, and she says, as an echo of feminism, that ecofeminism goes beyond discussion and searches for concrete solutions to daily life problems. So thinking of ecofeminism as an echo of feminism. Along similar lines, in contrast with first world theologians who are seeking to reclaim the importance of nature in their cultures and contexts. So here in the first world, we're trying to encourage a sense of greater reverence and awe for all of creation because we feel so separated from it, for example. Kwok Pulan points out that Asian feminist theologians are faced with a different challenge, which is the glorification of nature while their own bodies are being denigrated, which is something that I don't think we think of too often here in that way. Reflecting an emphasis on concrete realities found in many third world theologies, she explains, quote, the glorification of nature in Asian elite culture and the admiration of nature's aesthetic beauty do not lead to concern for the poor and oppressed. Instead of viewing nature in an abstract sense, Asian feminists see nature as the source of life and that women's relationship with nature is seen in terms of a political struggle for justice. End quote. This is another key nuance in third world feminist theology. And she also has seen an increase in the number of ecologically centered approaches in writings from Asia. Similar to McFay, she highlights God's power to sustain and renew creation and to call forth a new heaven and a new earth, to cite the scripture passage. And she sees this as a symbol of hope in the face of our planetary situation. She also has another unique concept that she calls the recycling of Christianity, which retrieves helpful aspects and paradigms within Christianity and kind of lets go of the things that are not. So kind of using that idea of like, what do we need to go back? That's what a lot of feminist theologians do as well, to go back within the tradition and say, okay, what has been lost here that we need to reclaim and recycle? But I think it's kind of a nice play on words, if you will, in the ecological dimension. I was thinking about this earlier today, about one of the reasons I like ecofeminist theology so much is that it's with no pun intended, very down to earth, you know? It's very much and I've said this multiple times throughout my visit here so far, just that connection of the intellectual with the affective dimensions, the connection with the theoretical and the practical dimensions, that balance between those two. As part of her theological response to the injustices we talked about, Nadasen applies an ecofeminist hermeneutic to mainstream biblical interpretations and Christian traditions regarding the relationship between humanity and our natural environment. So what I'm going to be doing next is kind of talk about, so how do we apply this hermeneutic to the Christian tradition, particularly Scripture, and then how does that influence the way in which our Christian consciousness is shaped? So she draws a lot on indigenous spiritualities and ecological ethics in her writings. And like I've kind of alluded to before, her hermeneutic possesses themes of healing and reconciliation between the first and the third world, between men and women, between humanity and our natural environment, and between God and all creation. So in the limited time that we have, I'm just going to focus on her theological anthropology and her spirituality, in a nutshell. So one of the central ways in which her hermeneutic shapes her approach to theological anthropology is her identification of the roots and harmful implications of what's called the theology of dominion in mainstream Christian theologies. This is based around the command that we find in Genesis 1:28, calling on humanity to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, giving humanity dominion over all creation. And this provides the fundamental biblical foundations for the theology of dominion, where in fact, instead of being of service to the earth, it promotes the idea of dominion as the idea of domination in practice. Does that make sense? Okay, so she stipulates that the theology of dominion reinforces a hierarchical and dualistic and anthropocentric anthropologies as we discussed earlier. And she acquiesces with other ecofeminist theologians who draw that link between androcentric and anthropomorphic views in harm done to women and the earth. Expounding on these connections, she explains how these views reduce women to their procreative capacity. She says how the earth cooperates with seeds to produce plants in the same way women is to cooperate with the male seed to produce children, as a way of fulfilling that divine command of Genesis. And then these theologies that have been written by men historically in the early church include these types of presupposition, which reduce women to their procreative capacity as well. In light of the prevalence of this perspective, she says that Christian anthropology has been at the heart of making the female body an obstacle to the fullness of women's humanness in the hierarchy of creation. In effect, the predominant emphasis on women's biological fertility has diminished their creative opportunity, voice, and power in other areas of the church, contrasting with various voices and roles of women in the early Christian community, found within the text that eventually became part of the biblical canon. It's not to say that women's biological fertility can't be emphasized, it's just to the extreme that other aspects have not been highlighted. But beyond the history of the early church, Nadasen points out that dualism and negative appropriations of anthropocentrism remain central themes within mainstream theologies from the West, and have been assimilated by some third world theologies as well. She explains that the image of God is distorted by a traditional theology of dualism, which divides, as we talked about earlier, the body from the divine, and places the divine somewhere outside of ourselves instead of recognizing the divine within. It also separates our experience, the divine, from our everyday experiences as well. And this, unfortunately, has the impact of women being unable to recognize within themselves that they are, in fact, the image of God. Not to say that men don't have this issue as well, but this is where she's coming out of her experience in that, and as a result of these interpretations of Scripture. These themes continue to negatively impact women's theological self-understanding in both the first and third worlds. As I was talking with the group earlier, I've seen this tremendously with young women who struggle with their own self-image. We see that with eating disorders and other things, and the idea of having to keep up with whatever society is dictating to us about who we should be and what we should look like. Informed by a theological anthropology that diminishes the equality of women, some church leaders also condone biblical interpretations, which Nada Dawson insists legitimize violence against women and teach women submission and resignation in the face of such violence. As a result, women interiorize an inferior status from that of men. She avers that legitimized by the dominant culture and its values, women have acquiesced to the worst forms of violence, and women's bodies are the site of possession, conquest, control, and abuse. Her observations resonate with other third world ecofeminists as well. She quotes Vandana Shiva's assertion that, quote, the land, the forests, the rivers, the oceans, the atmosphere have all been colonized, eroded, and polluted. Capital now has to look for new colonies to invade and exploit for its further accumulation. These new colonies are, in my view, this is Shiva speaking, the interior spaces of the bodies of women, plants, and animals, end quote. While a direct correlation may be difficult to confirm on a practical level without further research, the theology of dominion fosters a hierarchical anthropology that tolerates violations against women in their integrity as persons, and justified by harmful interpretations of biblical texts. There's if you haven't heard of it, some of you maybe, I know you had another female speaker come in and talk about biblical interpretations. So Texts of Terror by Phyllis Churchill talks immensely about this. By way of definition, some of you may be familiar with this, but violence against women encompasses many types, such as physical, verbal, and emotional. This violence is often rooted in preconceived ideas of gender roles that permit and tolerate harmful behavior, such as wife beating as an accepted and expected practice by both women and men. A common understanding of gender-based violence, or GBV, is violence that is directed at an individual based on his or her specific gender role in society and intended to establish or reinforce gender hierarchies and perpetuate gender inequalities. Unfortunately, girls and women from both the first and third worlds experience higher incidences of gender-based violence than boys and men. Similar to how women's integrity is minimized by a hierarchical view of anthropology informed by the theology of dominion, the intrinsic value of creation is diminished by actions focused primarily on the benefit for humanity, often in the short term, without considering the harmful effects for the ecosystems upon which we all depend upon for survival. Political science and sociology scholar Erica Cudworth expresses how definitions of violence against the earth are shaped by culture and change over time, similar to gender conditioning and definitions of gender-based violence. She argues that, quote, a key element of normative definitions of violence is physical damage, and deep and feminist ecologies are right to include the destruction of habitats and ecosystems as a form of violence. Cudworth points out that acts of commission, such as disrupting ecosystems through the destruction of wetlands and emission, such as refraining from taxing resources by governments, contribute to harm done to the earth. Nada Dawson supports the works of Carolyn Merchant and others who observe that Western scientific pursuits utilize the concept of dominion to justify actions that discount the intrinsic value of creation. From her perspective, the interpretation of dominion as justification for domination greatly influenced post-World War II development projects and the competition for power during the Cold War. Freedom from colonization coincided with a fascination for Western science and technology, and the Cold War perpetuated this influence, supporting development ventures that continue to degrade the earth. In response, she argues that mainstream theology has not addressed this enough or emphasized the connections between the resource-exacting nature of the present development paradigm and the theology of dominion. She suggests that the marginalization of liberation, post-colonial, and ecofeminist theologies, particularly in the churches, may be the cause of this lacuna in mainstream theologies. So what happens typically, even in academic circles, is that liberation theologies, or these newer theologies, are put, I was saying this earlier, put at the end of a syllabus, and it's kind of, if we get to that, we'll do them all under the same umbrella instead of weaving them through the whole entire syllabus. We have to, so the first, it's more taken from a historical perspective, even if you're not a historian, that we have to recover all of these theologies first, and that there's, as many of you know, a fear around feminist theologies, particularly in Catholic circles, and especially at the Vatican. I'm not sure what they mean by radical feminism. I wish it'd be a little clearer about that. So, because Eaton talks about radical meaning at the root, you know, that radical feminism goes back to our roots. And I like that idea of radical feminism, that it's more about going back to the root of things, and again, back to that healing perspective. On the other hand, Netta Dawson acknowledges that some theologians do not equate the concept of dominion with domination. She notes that some mainline and evangelical theologians translate dominion as a form of Christian service. She briefly mentions that Ruther is one theologian who attempts to reframe dominion in conjunction with the related concepts of Sabbath and stewardship. Some theologians from the Global South, however, perceive stewardship as a distinction in a high office as the steward, the tiller, and keeper, which is one positive interpretation. However, some indigenous theologians recognize that stewardship can be connected with colonizers and also Neo-European ways that are, quote, laced with imperialistic and racist notions, end quote. She also says, like I've mentioned before, that many eco-theologians criticize stewardship because, again, it does not recognize that intrinsic value. Another interrelated ecological challenge is the issue of population growth. Netta Dawson affirms that there is a pressing need for population control, but she argues that there are racial overtones that persist in pointing to the third world population as central as a central contributing factor, and that the focus on population control actually disregards other implications for women. She says that, or she points out that this myopic view fails to account for the brutal invasion into women's bodies by population control programs to protect the earth from overpopulation. And it also muddies the links between poverty and inequality, both of resource use as well as inequality in the environmental burden peoples put on the world. So what she's trying to say is that the lifestyle of people in the first world is so much greater than the way we tax resources, as opposed to the lives of people in the third world. Even if their populations are larger, they still live more simply. Similar to the issue of population growth, like I mentioned, racist overtones persist in sustainable development. And this term is questioned by many people in the Global South because it was developed by people in the North. The term sustainable development shares consonance with the theology of dominion in actual practice. Netta Dawson argues for situating environmental racism within the context of economic globalization to sharpen the critique of the concept of sustainable development. And she says that there are challenges that are related to this in connection with environmental racism, such as the degradation of habitats of people of color, the dumping of toxic waste in the habitats of oppressed, or here in the US, and people of different minority races, and the control of knowledge systems. So as some people were talking earlier about this, capturing of seeds, or trying to make sure that only certain groups have control over those seeds. Netta Dawson recognizes that poverty drives indigenous peoples to abandon traditional sustainable practices and participate in resource depletion in order to provide for their families. However, this is often because some women have to choose between saving a tree and saving their child. So it's a very difficult choice for them to make. So she insists that just because people have abandoned some of these indigenous practices doesn't mean that it can't diminish the ongoing work that indigenous communities are doing to promote sustainability. She acknowledges that for most thoughtful Christians, this idea of the theology of dominion is no longer normative, but that it continues to influence our Christian attitudes, and I would venture to say in Clifford's words, our consciousness. We still believe that the earth is really for our benefit, and that this is a consciousness that needs to be shifted. And she says that this idea of how the theology of dominion undermines women's inner authority and colludes with violence by commission or omission has to be corrected by the recognition of history of injustice experienced by some sections of our communities because of their race, their caste, and their ethnic origins. From her perspective, she sees three motifs that need to be woven together for eco-theology: God, grace, and transformation. She draws upon Leonardo Boff, who talks about disgrace, and she says that we're faced with the challenge of reinterpreting grace to have meaning for us today in our world, where we are disgraced by the way we have lived with the earth, which opens up opportunities for new definitions of grace, and that allow us to love the earth in a different way and to work for justice. So this is her approach to anthropology. In addition, she says that ecofeminist theology also tries to reclaim aspects of the feminine and spirituality, particularly within third world cultures, that promote our connection, humanity's connection with creation, and also responsibility for earth care. She said that third world ecofeminist theology has made women conscious of their responsibility and has given rise to a new spiritual energy that leads them to find God. She asserts that from an ecofeminist perspective, our current environmental situation necessitates bringing the wisdom and knowledge of the poor, of indigenous women, of Dalit women, that has over the centuries been systematically ignored and suppressed, to the forefront of theological discourse. In addition to the biodiversity knowledge possessed by indigenous peoples, Nadadasan describes some of the spiritual beliefs associated with their traditions of prudent care. For instance, some communities set aside areas of protected land believed to be inhabited by spirits of the ancestors, and often this land serves as a place for teenage initiation rites. In other places, sacred groves are known as God's abode, or the abode of cobras, and here certain kinds of trees cannot be cut down as they're considered to be abodes of the divine. Exemplifying her point about the relationship between indigenous women and the earth, she documents a conversation with an indigenous Indian leader in which she says, "Life starts on the land for the woman. From the moment she is born, earth is like our mother. And although humans go through life and death, the earth will never die. But this requires that we as women, who also go through the same processes as birthing and caring for our children, need to also nurture the earth." So it's just one example of this deep connection and see some kind of relationship, almost like a sisterly relationship in a way, with the earth. Another point is that this spiritual energy and that is the shaping the spiritualities and has shaped spiritualities of indigenous women is something that first world women and other first world theologians can really learn from the third world, not just something there's not just that first world theologians have something to teach the third world. Again, this epistemological privilege that third world women have. She says that the traditions of prudence, which is an expression she kind of creates to talk about the form of ethics that indigenous people use to care for the earth, grounds women-centered movements of political struggles to protect the earth, and movements of resistance that have existed throughout India's history. So how many of you heard the Chipko movement before? A few? How many of you heard of tree huggers? That's where it comes from. Yeah, where these women literally stood in front of the trees and hugged them when contractors came in to bulldoze them. They were willing to risk their lives to protect the environment. Yeah, that's where it comes from. Yeah, so this is just one example of it. And again, this is a history we never hear about, you know. Anyway, that's an inside point. Okay. The way she describes it, I think it's great. She says, they used the only forms of resistance available to them. They clung to the trees, defying the saws of contractors. I mean, that's great, right? So as a result, the influence of indigenous women spread beyond their own localities to other environmental movements in India, which continues today. She reports that additional positive strides, so we're moving to a positive, it's not all negative here, that these women are making, such as securing property rights, participating in local governments. In some ways, in some areas of the third world, women are participating in governance at higher levels than even here in the U.S. And also partnering with men in pursuing and deciding alternatives to government forestry programs that harm the environment. So women get their resources from the forest, and men focus on timber extraction, which ends up, and then their timber extraction takes priority over the women's ability to go and procure resources from the forest, which is why there's a tension there. Along similar lines, the powerful role of the feminine possesses a long history in the spiritual life of many Indian communities. She writes that in pre-Aryan thought, nature was symbolized as the embodiment of the feminine Shakti, or energy or power. And Prakriti, or nature, manifests this primordial energy from which women draw their Shakti. Concepts such as Earth Goddess and Mother Earth that are used in people's everyday language underline this. And I think in here we kind of have that suspicion of Mother Earth, what is that about, you know? It's not something that's a common language you use in Christian language, I feel. And she asserts that Asian women discover God in this spiritual energy. So again, seeing how third world women draw from that divine within that has seemed to move outside of ourselves, I think, in Western Christianity. She points out that women in the third world are trying to recover patterns of spirituality that connect them to their indigenous roots. Again, if we're talking about that rooted piece of this, that radical ecofeminism back to the root. It's a spiritual, although they may not use that language, is a spiritual search for a more holistic approach to life. Now, it often asks the question, so then, you know, in light of all of these traditions and approaches to spirituality in indigenous traditions, she asks, is there something Christianity can learn from such spiritual interdependence with the earth, so that we too, as Christians, can become more earth-centered in our approach? She suggests a twofold transformation of and she draws on Protestant Larry Rasmussen's theology and ethics to respond to environmental justices facing our world today. The first, she says, is to recognize the validity of the wisdom of traditions of prudent care that are practiced by indigenous peoples. So again, recognizing the epistemological knowledge of indigenous peoples. And the second is that faith communities must be willing to challenge current environmental regulation and dominant economic paradigms that sustain the destruction of the earth. So really being willing to challenge that type of consciousness that doesn't see the intrinsic value of all creation. She says that we have a moral obligation, responsibility to find sustainable alternatives. And along these lines, she talks about some of the work that the World Council of Churches has done, including exploring the idea of what's called the spirituality of resistance as a theological basis for alternatives to environmental degradation. She notes that for Asian women, quote, the spirituality for life that is at the heart of our struggles for justice and peace in a world of deep injustice and violence points us to the Asian Indian Jesus who with compassion and passion empowers us to resist all that destroys us, our communities, and our world, end quote. From her perspectives, Christians must return to that liberative core of the gospel, and we need to become the Church of Jesus Christ in our world today through our actions for healing and reconciliation between peoples of all faiths to overcome violence, not only against women, but the earth as well. She has a quote at the end of her monograph that I think is really powerful. She says, the task before us is then to resist all forces, powers, and systems that reduce, deny, or destroy life, and to embrace a politically engaged spirituality, end quote. So now just in summary, tonight we've explored how Christian ecofeminist theology brings the devastating effects of environmental degradation to the forefront of theological discourse. And we've done so by highlighting the lived experience and wisdom of those persons and ecosystems most adversely affected, and by advocating for ecological justice. As Eve notes, ecofeminism, quote, is about a desire to heal the wounds caused by the splits between nature and culture, mind and body, women and men, reason and emotion, spirit and matter, theory and action, and ultimately between humans and the earth, end quote. I surmise that I might be preaching to the choir here when I say that ecofeminist theologians challenge all of us to become aware of how the Christian tradition and our lived Christian faith can embrace necessary changes for the good of our global community and contribute to that radical transformation in global consciousness that Ann Clifford talks about. Ecofeminist theologies continue to evolve and develop in response to concrete realities, further research, and dialogue with various interlocutors. As Eve points out, ecofeminist theologies must correspond with the lived realities of those most marginalized, otherwise they have little liberatory potential. She insists that if theology remains in tune with these experiences, quote, religions can be a social force, politically engaged, and ecologically transformative. Historically, deep spiritual movements are one of the most powerful forces to change the world, end quote. As I mentioned to the group earlier today and to Yolanda last night, I was at a talk on Friday night with people who were trying to say, how do we survive in a post-Vatican II church and how do we keep at it? And the speaker said that it's always the creative minority that's moving things forward. So just like you to keep that in mind as well. So Nada Dassin remarks that what might be the most difficult challenge, she's saying this directly to feminist theologians, but I think it has pertinence for us as well, is to recognize that none of us holds the final truth. She calls upon theologians to read the texts and traditions with new eyes and to retell the story of salvation so that it can offer a word of liberation to all women and to all people. At the moment, it does not. And just as a sidebar, the word salvation, this comes from salve, to be made whole again. And so if we have that idea of salvation, we're all called to that, right? To bring about peace, to bring about healing, to bring about transformation. And for those of us who've never had to struggle for daily clean water or with food scarcity, it might be difficult for us to imagine the profound impact it has on our quality of life. That's why I believe the sharing of these women's stories is important, because it concretizes and puts a human face to what people are experiencing. Ideally that happens in a real encounter, but if we can't have that real encounter, which actually, if we did have that real encounter in the third world, would increase our carbon footprint. So maybe this might be the best thing that we can do, is to continue to listen and to hear the stories that are brought to the forefront of this theological discourse. As Vandana Shiva shared in a 2010 interview, quote, "It's amazing. The minute you put something into a graph, it has more meaning and weight than all the experience of the people of the world." I had a debate with a very famous economist once. He said, "What you're talking about is just anecdotes." I replied, "It's very strange how one economist making assumptions creates facts, and billions of people living their lives are mere anecdotes." Bringing the voices of third world women to the forefront of theology stretches our imagination, hugs and tugs at our discerning hearts, giving us pause to examine our complicity, apathy, and social responsibility, especially for those of us in the first world. These voices also expand our understanding of globalization, epistemology, and research methodologies. This is, as Nada Dassin says, this isn't an esoteric vision. This is something that's very concrete. For those of us who practice Christianity, we're reminded that we're a people, a resurrection people, people of hope, who are challenged to live out the gospel message in the world with all people of goodwill. The holistic approach of Christian ecofeminist theologies brings greater balance to our understanding and experience of God's immanence and transcendence. Jesus' embodied spirituality and social action, and the Holy Spirit's guiding breath of renewal and restoration. This challenges us to embrace a politically engaged spirituality in a world that is at once charged with the grandeur of God, in the words of Hopkins, and concurrently suffering from a diminished sense of awe and reverence for all of creation and our interconnectedness and interdependency. It's my hope that through greater dialogue with theologians throughout the world, we too can contribute to that radical transformation of consciousness that leads toward healing and wholeness within our global ecological community. Thank you.
We thought we'd have some time for questions and answers, and then have cookies and lemonade to just talk among ourselves more intimately, more directly. I can pass around the mic, but I'm kind of thinking that if we all agree to speak loud, that we can do the questions.
Gretchen, have you been to any third world countries?
I have not. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, is that a goal?
It is a goal. Funding is always a goal to get there. But I will say that prior to my work at Marquette, I had studied at the graduate, I told some people this as well. I studied at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and most of my friends were from the third world. And that's why I say personal encounter is so important, because I was really transformed by their stories and our friendships. And it changed the trajectory of my research, because it's just some of the things that I thought were important just didn't seem as important. And I really just felt compelled by the theologies then that I read that were from these voices, and wondering why they weren't on my syllabus and why I wasn't hearing about them. But I absolutely would love to go and to do research. And right now I have to rely on it's kind of like I feel like the Samaritan woman at the well, I have to rely on the testimony of others before but I still believe it, you know? So I really want to go, but yeah, hopefully in the future I will.
Excellent presentation, thank you. Couple of questions. First would be, I wonder if you hope to see a reconciliation between the theology of dominion and that of ecofeminism. And if so, how do you see that playing itself out in today's theological world? Second thought would be, what do you plan to do with your research?
You know, a great public company. But the first question I think is a really great one, I think, because it is at different levels. So one of the reasons, like I said, I really was drawn to Nada Dawson is because she wants to keep one foot in the academic world and one foot in the world of the church. And so there's a theologian, some of you may know, called David Tracy, and he says there's three publics for theology: the academy, the church, and society. So when we talk about how can ecofeminist theology change the theology of dominion, I think that it has to be changed at all those different levels. Does that make sense? So I think, you know, people who are writing these theologies have to be more open and have to take it seriously that these voices do count and matter, and they have to move closer to the center. But that might mean our understanding of epistemology is different. It might not be
But how do you move from the academic to the real world?
Yes, exactly. So, and so that's why I think too that in the churches, I mean, we can do a show of hands here for people who maybe, or whatever community, religious community. How many of you have heard anyone speak out from the pulpit or about social sin related to environmental degradation? Anyone?
Pretty rare.
A handful of people. Yeah, I know in Catholic churches it's very, very rare. I don't know that I've ever heard of it. So I think there's a way, and that's where a number of people are, at least from religious communities. They're gathered together on the weekend to worship together in one way, shape, or form. So finding ways to see that this is a real central issue and that's being taken seriously by church leaders and religious leaders. So I think interfaith organizations could really, this is a wonderful area in which they can partner, and that's another reason why I think the Third World is a model for that, because people there are living interreligious dialogue in ways that people in the First World are not, you know. So, and then thirdly, in society. So I think finding people who are sympathetic to the similar concerns but may use different language to talk about it. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think that's really satisfactory, but it might be a starting point.
No, that's okay. Do you see the Occupy movement as part of ecofeminism?
You know, I don't know of, I know of the Occupy movement, but I think, you know, that ecofeminism came out of involvement with other social movements, so I think it's definitely possible. I just think that what I've noticed in my work with young adults on the college campus is that many people who are involved in social justice activities, even if they're sponsored by a ministry office, are really disillusioned with religious institutions, if they're even connected to them at all. So I think, and I think also, we've talked about this earlier in the day, but that the word feminism starts to core with people somewhat negatively, depending on who they are. And then someone else raised a point about the role of men in that. So I think that ecofeminism is a word, you know, may or may not continue forward but the concepts that are associated with it, that is to try and redress the domination of women in nature and the relationship between the two, I think something that can definitely be addressed by other social movements as well. So partnering with other social movements could be a way forward. And definitely organizations like the UN have put this on the top of their list as well. But I think we have to think more, you know, locally too. What are we doing to partner with other, how can we